Hello and welcome to the sixth edition of JLU Media Fest. Today we have with us Mr. M.Veeraraghav sir. He is the executive editor of BQ Prime. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us today. My first question to you is regarding the geopolitical demographics of a country. The Prime Minister of a country speaks to be saying that this is the era of diplomacy and dialogue is the way. But then the conditions worldwide seems to portray a different picture. So I just wanted to know that what are your opinions and do you really think that this is the era of diplomacy?
It has to be the era of diplomacy and dialogue, right? The problem is that there is conflict, there is war. How do you avert that war? You can avert that war only by dialogue. I don't think it's just Mr. Modi who's saying the era of diplomacy. I think around the world, people, what you want is people to work problems through diplomacy. If India and Pakistan have an issue, work it through diplomacy. I think it's very important to recognize that it's irrespective of which prime minister who has said it. I think what Mr. Modi is trying to say is that you need to resolve this on diplomacy and not through conflict, right? Yes, the world is in turmoil. There is a lot of conflict. There is a lot of polarization. There are strong opinions. Now, how do you overcome that? You have a Ukraine-Russia conflict. How are you going to overcome that? You can do that only through diplomacy. Diplomacy and dialogue. And so that's really what it means. So the question that the world doesn't seem to be following diplomacy is wrong because there are two conflicts whereas so many other conflicts are not there. So I think large parts of the world are relying on diplomacy. And the hope is that these countries which are in conflict, whether it is Russia, whether it is a China which is in conflict with a Vietnam, whether it is an India which is in conflict with a Pakistan or another country which is in conflict with Israel, which is in conflict with the Arab world or several African nations, the only way to solve these problems is through diplomacy. And I think that's what the Prime Minister was referring to.
So you would want to say that dialogue is the way for our future, like that's the way we should be dealing with all these crises.
Not just me. I don't think anyone will tell you that dialogue is not the way forward and you have to go and fight. If you are having a conflict with your classmate, let's say you and XYZ is having a fight, your teacher is not going to come down and say that, this is the way to solve the problem out. They are going to try and say, talk with each other and try and figure this problem out, right? So dialogue is the way out. That's not just what I'm saying. I think that's the only way to go about it.
So we talked about polarization, but then again, the Indian, media model that is primarily ownership based. So do you think that somewhere or the other we are promoting what we all have learned as manufacturing, manufacturing consent. So do you really think that the ownership model has proved to be problematic and maybe we need to shift towards something different?
Ownership is just one of the filters that Chomsky talks about. There are 4 other filters that he talks about, which is advertising, which includes propaganda, anti-communism as he calls it. It could be a different sense of nationalism somewhere here in India. So you see, ownership is only one part of the problem. Well, ultimately, if you don't have defined laws on ownership, you're going to have this kind of a problem, right? So, to look at it, it's just one needs to address it at different levels in terms of it. This is not the only issue that's down there. It's the question of other ways in which revenues are being generated by the media. Now, independent media organizations, which are not owned by large corporates, are not able to sustain because the subscribers are not willing to pay for it, right? So one needs to look at the issue from a larger point of view and not just look at it from an ownership only point of view. Maybe one of the problems, but then there are other issues also that need to be sorted out.
So we are a democratic country and we often talk about freedom of press. But the World Press Index says otherwise. We're at the 150th position. But do you believe that with the advent of digital media, maybe this would pave out a different way for us?
There was a very interesting study by this professor, James Curran, and I think some parts of it was quoted in, I'm not sure which book, I'm not able to recall right now, from the London School of Economics, I think, which talks about, again, I'm not sure of the school, but there's this very interesting study where they talk about, has technology actually reduced social inequalities or inequities, or has it actually widened it? For instance, for your voice to be heard well in a technology in the world of in the digital world, you need to have a smartphone. So if you have a more expensive smartphone with a faster internet connection, and you can speak in the dominant language of the internet, which is English in large ways, your voice gets more heard, right? Vis-a-vis somebody who's sitting, who doesn't have internet connectivity, who doesn't have the money to buy a very major the most state-of-the-art smartphone, who's not well versed with the dominant language, whether it is Hindi or in English, in terms of communication, that person's voice get lesser. Now, if you look at this profile, the one who can buy a smartphone, the one who has better internet connectivity, and the one who can speak the dominant language is usually the person who is economically much better off, right? And then on the other hand, you have the person who doesn't have the smartphone, a poor quality phone with poor internet, and doesn't speak the language. That would usually be somebody who's really poor and in rural parts. So technically what some people argue is that the digital world makes the ones whose voice were already heard stronger, and the ones who are not heard weaker. But within that particular thing, like for instance, urban voices are far stronger than rural voices. But slowly that also seems to be, sort of evening out as technology spreads across the board. So I think it requires great introspection to see whether digital world can actually improve and bolster free speech, because what one sees is also the Reuters report 2022, Digital News Report 2022, which I was referring to in my speech, clearly shows that in countries with great digital penetration, like in the US, the trust in anything people hear is falling, and that there is a growing number of people who just want to stay away from news because it makes them feel depressed and they don't know what to believe in. That is also a product of the digital world. So technology versus trust is something that one needs to really study and understand. It's a very important aspect, and I don't think there is a clear cut and right question that's there. Digital world has also tried to help in overcome certain challenges, whereas it's also resulted in certain new challenges which are very alarming and scary. For instance, fake news. The power of fake news to be peddled is much, much greater because of the digital world, right?
So as we talked about fake news, there's traditional media also. My last question to you is that, do you think that the traditional media and the new media would, coexist with each other, or the traditional media would have to realign itself?
What is traditional media?
Sir, print, television.
Give me one news organization.
NDTV.
Does it have an ndtv.com?
Yes, it does.
Do you find them online? Do you see the TV online?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, do. So is that new media or is it traditional media?
It is new media.
So then you said it's traditional media when you started with.
No, I mean, primarily they were a traditional media. Now they are into, media convergence.
What is the difference? What is the difference between traditional and new media? Are you talking, see, there are 2-3 distinctions here. One needs to be careful. One is dominant media, which is the mainstream media, and the off the curb, small ones, small news websites which are out there, which are not the dominant media, okay? When you say traditional media, you are talking of originally the dominant large media houses, right? Now the large media houses are not digital first. So you have a HuffPost, you have a Daily Beast, you have a Scroll, or you have a Print, or you have the Wire.com here, which are the new media organizations that you're talking, which are only digital world. They are not yet the dominant ones. But the dominant ones are also in this new space. Whether it is a Hindu, whether it is a Times of India, whether it is an NDTV, whether it is an India Today, they are all there in the online space, and the amount of money they are spending on developing that digital product is enormous. So the traditional media, the mainstream media is now looking at trying ways to find itself big on the online space, whereas the smaller guys who are only digital first are also trying to compete in that space. So that's what's happening.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful insights. With camera person Shivendra, Alisha Ali from Lakecity Live, Bhopal.